So the endocrine system will be kind of a continuation of some stuff we've already just been introducing with the digestive system, right? Because we saw that an important way that digestive processes are controlled are by hormones released by the GI tract. Like, what were some of the hormones released by the GI tract?
Secretin,
Say it again, Jumba.
secretin and cholecystokinin.
Yeah. So, like, what does secretin do?
Secreting stimulates release of the bicarbonate by the pancreas.
So that was like if the small intestine is low pH, it talks to the pancreas to do the bicarbonate juice. How about someone else? What does CCK do?
Releases bile and something else too. Forget.
What else does it talk to?
The enzymes.
Enzymes.
Yeah, so it's talking both to the gallbladder to squeeze for bile, also to the pancreas for all the enzymes. Um, right, so hormones are not just about like endocrine system. Um, Another hormone that we didn't talk about, I'll just kind of give you just a sense of how widespread, like atrial natriuretic peptide, like your heart releases hormones. If the atria are getting more stretched out because like your blood volume is too high, they'll release this atrial natriuretic peptide, which talks to the kidneys and says, like, get rid of more sodium, which gets rid of more water, which is going to do what? What's going to happen if you're letting go of more sodium and water from your body? How's that going to affect your blood volume and your blood pressure? It's going to decrease. It's going to bring down your blood volume and your blood pressure. Right? So this idea of hormones, they are released by lots of different organs to do all sorts of different control in your body. What we're going to focus on today are the specific endocrine glands that are making hormones as their kind of main job in your body. So let's kind of dig in, and we'll talk more detail about hormones and classes of hormones and actions of hormones and things like that. So, endocrine system. Um, so, and again, hormones are signaling molecules. And rather than just being like released in a synapse or something directly at their target, they tend to be broadcast more widely. Typically like released you know, into the bloodstream. Which means any of your cells that has the appropriate receptor is going to respond anywhere in your body. Um, and there's also things like called paracrines. Paracrines are when a cell releases some signaling molecule, and it's not necessarily getting absorbed into the bloodstream and going everywhere. It's more kind of staying nearby and just affecting the cells in the vicinity. So there's actually a continuum of signaling molecules. But what we're going to be talking about mainly right now are these ones that are sent everywhere. We can talk about two kind of broad classes of hormones. One are kind of amino acid based. This includes peptides. Right? Peptide is just a bunch of amino acids connected together, like insulin. Everybody's heard of insulin. Insulin is just 37 amino acids connected together. Proteins. And also things that are like slightly modified version of amino acids. We saw that like adrenaline is just a couple of enzymatic steps away from tyrosine, right? So these are kind of the most common of the hormones. They're basically peptides or proteins or related molecules. The other ones are the ones that are steroid. These are kind of based on cholesterol. I should say kind of derived from cholesterol. What do we know about the fundamental things that we've talked about? If something is, how is cholesterol fundamentally different from like a protein?
Cholesterol are
Sounds like a lipid
A
structure.
lipid.
it can go through the cell membrane because of its hydro.
Right, so this is a lipid, so it means it's hydrophobic. Which brings in a couple of important things about steroid hormones. And steroid hormones are like the sex hormones. We're going to talk about those in much more depth today, as well as getting much more into those over the last lecture on Thursday when we get into the reproductive system. Steroid hormones obviously can't just dissolve in the bloodstream. I'm saying released into the bloodstream, distributed. If you are a lipid, you're going to need help. So these are going to require carriers in order to move around. In fact, when people are talking about the levels of these hormones in your body, they usually talk about bound versus free, like bound testosterone versus free testosterone. Like how much is actually still attached to the carriers getting moved around versus how much has been released to actually interact with receptors. So when we talk about steroid hormones, you'll often talk about bound versus free. And like Jamba mentioned, lipid-based molecules, hydrophobic molecules, they can freely pass into a cell membrane. So when we think about where the receptors are for these different kinds of hormones, they're going to be located on different parts of the cell. So if I think about, here's my cell. This is supposed to be a cell. It's supposed to be the nucleus. For these amino acid-based ones, you're going to have receptors that are on the cell membrane. And they're going to bind on receptors there, and they're going to initiate some second messenger pathway typically and create some effect inside the cell. Steroid hormones, on the other hand, these things, they can just drift through the cell membrane, assuming they get there, right? They have to arrive bound to a carrier, but once they get there, they can just drift through, and not only that, they can drift into the nucleus. So the receptors for these dudes typically end up being in the nucleus and are more likely to cause more like, affecting transcription, translation, things like that inside, and, regulating cell activities in direct ways in there. I will also mention, just as a kind of an aside, we're not going to go that deep into it, but the receptors for these steroid hormones are pretty weird. We spent a lot of time looking at kind of the classic second messenger kind of G protein coupled receptor that you find on the cell membrane. We did all of our explanation of how like serotonin binds and shifts the transmembrane helices and activates the G protein. These dudes, the receptors for the steroid hormones, they're way weirder, and they have multiple subparts that detach and reattach, and so just to kind of put that out there, it's a whole other kind of kettle of fish. But we're not going to I'm not. I mean, that's yeah. It's they're still figuring out the details of exactly how these like receptors work in there. Um, all right. So the two main kinds of hormones. We should also talk about what kinds of things will cause the release of a hormone. So let's now talk about control of hormone release. And up to this point, we've actually seen two different types of hormonal control. What are some of the things that can control or stimulate the release of hormones?
Action potentials and like neurons.
So one is neural control, right? We saw that. Where did we see neurons affecting the release of hormones?
After they receive a stimulus as a result of an action potential.
But what specific hormone did we see that was controlled by the nervous system?
ADH.
No.
No, sorry. It's released by Pituitary Gland.
I mean, go back to the nervous system. What hormone was released by the autonomic nervous system?
Acetylcholine.
Epinephrine.
Epinephrine, right? Epinephrine, adrenaline. Adrenaline was released when the sympathetic nervous system triggers the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine, adrenaline into your body. So that was kind of a direct release of hormones controlled by the nervous system. And we talked a little bit about like the renin-angiotensin mechanism actually can be triggered by the nervous system. So there you actually do have hormones that are released secondary to kind of neural stimulation. But in terms of like kind of direct control of the release, my main thought is like kind of the triggering of the adrenal medulla by the sympathetic nervous system. What other kinds of things can control the release of hormones?
Stretch.
So stretch, as opposed, and lots of other things. I'm going to say environmental stimuli. Just things happening in your body, whether it's stretching of things or whether it's pH of things or whether it's presence or absence of some molecules or whatever. When we get to insulin, it's going to be the presence of hold on a second here. There's some things I need to deal with. Oh man. Hopefully that's gonna work. So environmental stimuli. I mean, that was kind of how we had the release of secretin and CCK controlled, just by the presence of low pH or fats and other things in the small intestine trigger the release of these hormones. So environmental stimuli, just stuff going on in your body. That's what I mean by that. And then finally, one of the really important ones, and one that's going to be kind of at the core of the control of kind of the cycles when we get to the reproductive system next time, is going to be other hormones. We call them tropic hormones. A hormone that controls the release of yet another hormone is called a tropic hormone. And we're going to see all sorts of these complicated feedback loops where one hormone controls the release of another hormone, be it that hormone then comes back to control the release of that original hormone that was controlling the release of that hormone. So we're going to see all sorts of kind of feedback loops with hormones controlling other hormones. Again, it's going to kind of reach a pinnacle when we get to like the whole kind of cycle and the monthly cycle for like female reproduction, with leading to kind of the development of the eggs and the ovary and the walls of the uterus, and then ovulation and blah 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 and all that coming back. That's all going to be controlled by hormones talking to other hormones talking to other hormones. So lots of examples we're going to see of hormones being controlled by other hormones. So what else do I want to say here? So I think what we're going to do for the rest of today is just kind of do this kind of list of what are the main endocrine glands, and what are the main hormones released by those glands, and what are the functions of those hormones released by those glands. So we'll start by looking at the pituitary, since the pituitary, I've mentioned back in the nervous system, is kind of this master gland. So let's go back to the brain, and the pituitary gland is controlled by what?
Hypothalamus.
Hypothalamus. So to do this, we've got to start with the hypothalamus. So we have the hypothalamus of the brain. And then hanging off of the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. It's also, in anatomy, you probably remember it was called the hypophysis. For art class, you can just call it the pituitary gland. There's two main parts to it. This posterior pituitary versus the anterior pituitary. This was the adenohypophysis versus the neurohypophysis. So first I'll talk a little bit about how the hypothalamus controls the pituitary, and then we're going to talk about the specific hormones released by the pituitary. In both cases, the hypothalamus is controlling the release of hormones by the pituitary. For the posterior pituitary, it's like a really direct thing. There's neurons, there's special neurons in the hypothalamus which actually reach down, and actually that's what's releasing the hormones into the body. It's actually these kind of modified neurons that are actually spitting out the hormone into the body. That's why it's called the neurohypophysis. If you actually look at it, again, if those of you who've been in anatomy, you remember it looks very different from the anterior pituitary. It's more just like a bunch of axons running through, coming down from the hypothalamus. Again, we're going to talk much more about this in a little bit. Anterior pituitary, this is derived from more from epithelial tissue. This is more classic glandular tissue, but it's still controlled by the hypothalamus, and it's controlled by these hormones, these tropic hormones, hormones that go from the hypothalamus and then talk to here. We call them releasing hormones. So there are releasing hormones that are released by the hypothalamus and talk to the anterior pituitary, telling it to release a variety of different things. Um, One of the ones that we're going to be looking at in much detail when we get to the reproductive system, like so for instance, there's a bunch of different ones. So I'm going to say, like, for example, e.g. GnRH, which in fact, let me use my little keyboard thing because it's going to make life easier here. This is Tropic releasing hormone. Meaning it's going to control the release of the gonadotropins, these sex hormones from, or these things that control the sex hormones from the pituitary. Basically, gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to release these or cause a release of hormones from the pituitary that are ultimately going to talk to your gonads and ultimately have them releasing like testosterone or estrogen and stuff like that. Like I said, a lot of times there's going to be these kind of complicated loops going on. So we'll come back to gonadotropin releasing hormone in a lot of detail when we get to the reproductive system. And again, there's lots of other releasing hormones. There's thyrotropic releasing hormone and things like that. Adrenocorticotropic releasing hormone. Don't worry about knowing all the specific releasing hormones. Just know that for all the things that we're talking about, the anterior pituitary releasing, it's probably controlled by some releasing hormone that came from the hypothalamus originally. So the hypothalamus releases these hormones, again, which collectively we're calling releasing hormones. They're typically little peptides, like 7, 8 amino acids long. They talk to the anterior pituitary. Then the anterior pituitary will then, in response to that, release its hormones, which we're going to talk about in detail. Just as an aside, again, this is something in anatomy we talk more about, but for right now, I'll just mention just because it's kind of cool. Um, we talked about all these portal systems, right? There was the hepatic portal system. What is a portal system? If I say there's a portal system,
The system of two capillary beds.
a system of two capillary beds. So we had hepatic portal where you went from the digestive organs to the liver. There was a portal system in the nephron where you went from the glomerulus to the peritubular capillaries. There's a hypophyseal portal system where you have, actually want to do that, I want to do it lighter. You have capillaries up here in the hypothalamus, which pick up these releasing hormones and then deliver them to a secondary capillary bed directly here. So there's this kind of like nice direct delivery of these releasing hormones, which are created in the hypothalamus and then delivered through a secondary capillary bed into the anterior pituitary for the control of pituitary release. So this is kind of the background of the pituitary gland. And what we're going to do now is look at the specific hormones that are released by the anterior and the posterior pituitary. We'll start with the posterior pituitary because there's much fewer of them. And also one of them you already know very well. One of the ones made by the posterior pituitary is ADH, which you all know is just antidiuretic hormone, also called vasopressin. What does ADH do?
Opens the aquaporins. Or
Yeah, it's what it inserts all the aquaporins into the collecting ducts in the kidneys, which then is gonna do what?
absorb water from the collecting duct back into the body.
Exactly. That means we're gonna have a lot more water coming back into the body out of the collecting duct. You're gonna have less urine formation. That's why it's anti-diuretic. Vasopressin, it's increasing your blood pressure as well, both by retaining water as well as by, we talked about ADH is a potent vasoconstrictor. ADH also is talking to your hypothalamus to increase thirst. So ADH is doing all sorts of cool stuff. Um, so ADH. Um, Another one is oxytocin. So oxytocin does a variety of things. I mean, one of its famous roles, like in childbirth, oxytocin is what stimulates uterine contractions. Um, if you want to, if somebody, if you want to stimulate uterine contractions, you want to kind of speed up the process, you can actually give them oxytocin, and that's going to kind of speed things up. In general, this is one of the few examples of positive feedback loops in the body where you actually, like, as labor starts and the uterine contractions begin, that increases the release of oxytocin, which makes even stronger contractions, which creates even more oxytocin release, which makes even stronger contractions, which is even more oxytocin. So this is that whole kind of protracted labor until finally the baby pops out, in which case obviously that's the end of the loop. Um, Oxytocin also stimulates milk letdown. Um, the mammary glands, which are kind of prepared for milk production during pregnancy, oxytocin is what actually stimulates milk letdown, actually kind of squirting out of the milk. Um, so, and also because it's doing uterine contractions during nursing, it's also causing the uterus to kind of contract and kind of start coming back. It's been really stretched out during pregnancy. A lot of times women can actually feel their uterus um, kind of moving or contracting while they're nursing, because the same hormones that's stimulating the milk letdown is also contracting the uterus back. Um, Oxytocin also plays roles just in normal life. It's implicated in all sorts of bonding and nurturing behaviors. Um, it's released, kind of post-coital after sex. There's higher levels of oxytocin. That kind of comfortable, yummy feeling seems to be from oxytocin. Um, the work that I've been doing with MDMA, part of the mechanism of why MDMA seems helpful in therapy is increasing oxytocin release, which makes people feel more comfortable, more able to kind of build rapport with the therapist and share difficult things and feel safe. Um, Oxytocin is like, it's not just in humans. Like, they've done studies where humans and dogs release oxytocin. Um, they've shown like humans and dogs that are sharing, mutual gaze where they're staring into each other's eyes. Both the humans and the dogs have increased levels of oxytocin release. Again, it's kind of bonding. Um, Even in like mice, they've showed across many mammals. It's an important way that animals kind of connect and feel bonded to each other. Um, So yeah, sometimes people call it like kind of the cuddle hormone. So that's posterior pituitary, ADH and oxytocin. The rest we're going to do are coming from the anterior pituitary gland. And there's a bunch of them, so I can't draw them on this picture. I'm going to go to another slide now. Hold on, we need to mute somebody there. And again, the control of these is from the hypothalamus releasing hormones. So I'll just write that for just to kind of, whoops, releasing. Just to kind of reiterate, I'm going to talk about these hormones released from the anterior pituitary, but they are controlled by hormones from the hypothalamus. Again, this family that we collectively refer to as the releasing hormones. All right, so there's a variety of these. I'm going to start with ones that are tropic hormones, ones that control the release of yet other hormones. So let's start with some tropic hormones. One is ACTH, which is, in fact, I'm going to do my type tool because it's going to just make my life easier here. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, which, from its name, what do you think it might be talking to? Adreno.
To the adrenal glands.
Yeah, so this is talking to the adrenal gland. It's talking to a different part than the part that is releasing the. Hold on. It's talking to a different part than is releasing the adrenaline. It's talking to the adrenal cortex, which is releasing steroid hormones. So this is going to be more about releasing cortisol and stuff, which we're going to talk about in a little later. So it's talking to the adrenal gland, but not the same part that releases adrenaline. It's releasing steroid hormones from the adrenal gland. Another important tropic hormone released from the pituitary is going to be thyroid stimulating hormone. And again, from its name, it's pretty clear what it's going to do. And what's it going to talk to?
To the thyroid.
Yeah, so this is going to talk to your thyroid gland and trigger the release of thyroid hormone. Again, we're going to talk about that in more detail when we get to the thyroid gland. And then next, there's going to be the gonadotropins. The gonadotropins, again, from their name, are going to talk to your gonads. You know, to your ovaries if you're a woman, to your testes if you're a dude. There's two of these. There's going to be follicle stimulating hormone. And luteinizing hormone. So both of these are collectively called the gonadotropins. And again, they are controlled, the release controlled by gonadotropin releasing hormone. This is one of these dudes. I mentioned the one releasing hormone that we are going to be looking at specifically is gonadotropin releasing hormone. So gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is going to control the release of FSH and LH from the pituitary. And again, that's going to be at the core of a bunch of stuff we're going to talk about on Thursday when we get into the reproductive system. Just as a kind of spoiler alert, let's talk about these hormones a little more in detail. FSH. Actually, to understand FSH, let me do a quick little thing. Like in the male, the testes are basically just they make little sperm, which are these little free cells, and they make testosterone. Oh, I'm getting sloppy here. So things in the guide tend to be much more straightforward and simple in terms of the reproductive stuff. In the female, obviously she makes the oocytes, the eggs, but the egg is never on its own. But it's always got all these other cells around it. So this whole big thing, the egg along with all of the associated cells, is called a follicle. For that name follicle stimulating hormone to make sense, we have to understand what a follicle is. A follicle is the overall structure in the ovary that is the egg along with all its associated cells that are coming along with it. And this whole structure, in addition to providing kind of a thing to hold the egg, is also creating hormones. This thing here on its own is making estrogen, which is helping the uterus prepare for the pregnancy. And then after ovulation, like when the egg goes out to meet its destiny, these cells are left over. They continue to make hormones. They make progesterone. This is called the corpus luteum. This is after ovulation. This continues to make progesterone. Which is what maintains the uterine lining, the endometrium. So basically, this follicle is developing as the egg matures and also producing estrogen to kind of prepare the body, get things ready for ovulation. And then after ovulation, after the egg is actually ejected and goes down the fallopian tubes, the leftover cells continue being an important endocrine organ, this corpus luteum, which is making progesterone, which is telling the uterus, we just released an egg, keep the uterine lining, the endometrium intact because there's a potential pregnancy coming. Again, we're going to look at this in way more detail on Thursday. Basically, when progesterone finally drops, when the corpus luteum goes away, that's when menses, when the menstrual cycle starts. Because without the progesterone, the uterine lining falls apart and sloughs off. But these words are kind of, the reason why I'm doing this right now is you need to understand what a follicle is, and you need to understand what a corpus luteum is for follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone to make sense. So let's go back now to here. Follicle stimulating hormone now has a little more context. In a female, this stimulates the development of the follicle. Right, which I said is both maturing the oocyte, getting it ready to ovulate, as well as creating this endocrine structure, making estrogen there. Obviously, in a guy, it's not doing a follicle. What do you think it's doing in a guy? What would be the parallel thing to stimulating the development of the egg?
Sperm.
Stimulated, exactly. Maturity of sperm.
Yeah, so it stimulates sperm production. So FSH, the follicle in the woman, and sperm production in the guy. LH, the luteinizing hormone. So again, in a woman, this is what is going to trigger ovulation. And the development of the corpus luteum. So this happens like at the midpoint of the cycle, like 2 weeks in. There's a big spike in luteinizing hormone. The woman ovulates, and then the follicle reconfigures into the corpus luteum, which is making the progesterone, which is maintaining the uterine lining in preparation for a potential pregnancy. In a guy, obviously, it's going to be different. In a guy, luteinizing hormone is what stimulates the production of testosterone. On Thursday, we'll talk about this in more detail. We'll see the interstitial cells in the testes that have receptors for luteinizing hormone. And in fact, another name for luteinizing hormone, if you're just talking about a guy, people call it.
Add the new Google.
Gosh darn it. I'm sorry. I also have like I'm trying to like see the time, but also trying to keep things quiet. So luteinizing hormone in a guy, sometimes it's called ICSH, interstitial cell stimulating hormone. We'll talk about that in more detail on Thursday. All right, so these things I've just talked about here, ACTH, TSH, FSH, LH, these are all tropic hormones released by the pituitary gland that talk to other glands to release other hormones. There are also hormones made by the pituitary that are just straight up hormones that do their own thing. So let's talk about those. So hormones from the anterior pituitary continued. Right, so again, TSH, ACTH, LH, FSH. And again, remember LH and FSH collectively are the gonadotropins. Another really important one that comes from the pituitary is growth hormone. Which, does kind of what it sounds like. It's important for growth of all sorts of body tissues. During development, like if you're still like kind of growing, like you're a kid, more or less growth hormone actually, the amount of growth hormone is actually important for like the appropriate amount of development. This is as good a time as any to talk about some of the main pathologies of the endocrine system. Would be either what we call let me do a different color. So people, there can be hypersecretion, meaning secrete too much, or hyposecretion, not secreting enough. And this can occur for lots of different reasons. You can get hypersecretion, for instance, if you have a tumor in a endocrine gland, in which case you've got too much cell division, so too many cells making the hormone in your body, and you got too much of the hormone happening. If you have hypersecretion of growth hormone, you get like pituitary gigantism, where people just keep growing bigger and bigger, often bigger than their like musculoskeletal system can support. It can be very bad. They have to stop it, or else you can get really, everything gets way oversized to where you can't even support your own body weight. If you have hyposecretion, you can get pituitary dwarfism, where people just end up being really short and small. It's different than kind of a dwarf. Like there's a dwarf, which is like the dude from like Game of Thrones. That's a different kind of dwarfism, where like the body proportions are different and stuff. But pituitary dwarfism, like the body proportions are normal, but you're just really small. You can get hyposecretion for lots of reasons. You can get hyposecretion from autoimmune diseases, where your body is attacking your own glands, right? Type 1 diabetes, your body is attacking your pancreatic islets, so they're not releasing insulin. Hashimoto's syndrome, you are attacking your thyroid gland, so you're not releasing thyroid hormone. So there's a lot of pathological conditions involving the glands where you're either too much or too little. So growth hormone, as an adult, you still need adequate growth hormone just to kind of maintain your muscle mass and things like that. This is taken as a performance enhancing drug sometimes by people who are trying to really build up their muscles. But it can get weird. If you take too much of it, your long bones aren't going to get any longer, but flat bones can keep kind of growing and spreading out. People start looking weird, and their faces get all kind of flattened and strange looking. If you get too much of this as an adult, they call it acromegaly. That's hypersecretion as an adult. If you have too much as like while you're still growing, you just get this pituitary gigantism. So growth hormone. Another hormone made by the anterior pituitary is prolactin, which is kind of what it sounds like. It's basically getting the mammary glands ready to produce, kind of mother's milk. The mammary glands always have, kind of glandular tissue, but it's basically like, kind of quiescent. It's not active. So you have to kind of wake it up and get it matured and ready to go. So this is kind of happening during during pregnancy and getting things ready. So prolactin, kind of waking up and maturing the mammary glands. But again, I said it's the oxytocin from the posterior pituitary that actually stimulates the ejection, the milk letdown. So I think I think that's it. Let me double check that I'm not spazzing on any of these. Pituitary, prolactin, growth hormone. Yeah, so that's it. All right, so here you can now also see why when we talked about the hypothalamus being this core bridge between the nervous system and the endocrine system, the hypothalamus, through either releasing hormones or through more directly through the posterior pituitary, is controlling the release of all these other hormones. And it's some hormones directly, some hormones as tropic hormones to control even other glands. So ultimately your hypothalamus is pulling the string on your adrenal glands, on your gonads, on your thyroid gland. It's controlling all these things, talking to your kidneys. So you can really see like this idea of the nervous system and the endocrine system as they're really so intimately tied into each other. They're not separate. I mean, and like I mentioned in the very beginning of the semester, we split the body up into systems to kind of make it easier to talk about, but it's not true. It's kind of everything is so inextricably intertwined, where your brain and your nervous system and ADH, as well as the ACTH talking to the adrenal cortex, which releases aldosterone, is then controlling your kidneys, and the kidneys are the key thing controlling your blood pressure and your cardiovascular fun. Everything is so intertwined. So hopefully as you're kind of ending this class now, we're in the final week, hopefully you're getting this sense that it's this big messy kind of entangled, every system's entangled with other systems. Like when you're trying to figure out what's going on or what's going wrong or going right, you can't just look at one piece, because every piece is really entangled with other pieces. So I think that's important to kind of remember. All right. Where are we in terms of time? We are doing all right here. So then the other main glands that I want to talk about, we're going to talk about the thyroid gland. We're going to talk about the adrenal gland. We're going to talk about the pancreas. We're going to actually talk about the parathyroid glands. Talk about the gonads a little bit. And again, for each of these, you should just have a basic idea of what hormones are they releasing and what are the role of those hormones. Again, the gonads, we are going to be going into much more detail when we get deeper into the reproductive system. So let's start with the thyroid gland. So here's somebody, here's their larynx, here's their trachea going down into their lungs. Kind kind of right below your trachea, right below your larynx, kind of wrapped around the trachea, is the thyroid gland. It's kind of like a little bow tie. Obviously controlled by the thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary, which is being controlled by the thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. There are two main things that are released by the thyroid gland. The kind of most important one here, there's kind of thyroid hormone, which we call thyroxin. Which is also T3 and T4. There's actually different forms that get interconverted in between each other. T3 is let me spell it correctly. In fact, let me spell it using the type tool since it'll be just quicker. Triiodothyronine. And tetra. Tetra just means 4-iodothyronine. You don't have to remember triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine specifically as words, but mainly I'm putting this here because I do want you to know from the name of them that iodine is an essential part of this hormone. So in order to make thyroxin or thyroid hormone, you need iodine. If you don't have enough iodine in your diet, then you're not going to be able to make enough this thyroxin, enough of this thyroid hormone. In which case, if we go back up to the, anterior pituitary, the anterior pituitary is saying, oh, not enough thyroid hormone. I better increase the production of thyroid stimulating hormone because there's not enough thyroid hormone. And when that happens, the thyroid gland gets the message, oh, I'm getting the message, I should kind of enlarge. Let's increase the capacity to make thyroid hormone because I'm getting the signal from the pituitary. But the problem is if you don't got enough iodine, you're still not going to make the thyroxin, in which case the pituitary keeps sending the message of thyroid stimulating hormone and the thyroid gets even bigger. This is called goiter. So this is a classic endocrine disease. If you don't have enough iodine in your diet, your pituitary keeps pushing on the thyroid gland to get bigger and bigger to increase thyroid hormone production, which isn't going to happen without adequate iodine. You can see it. I've had students come in who have it. You can just see this big kind of growth right underneath, right here on their throat. Underneath, obviously. What is the thyroid hormone doing?
Metabolism.
It's involved in metabolism.
Yeah, so this is kind of controlling metabolic rate. Kind of how fast things are running, how much energy you're metabolizing and using. People who are hyperthyroid tend to get really kind of jittery. One of my colleagues realized he was hyperthyroid when he was like writing on the board and he was writing the next word before he finished writing the word he was in the middle of writing because his just thoughts were skipping to the next thing even. If people are hypothyroid, they tend to be more sluggish and kind of gain more weight because they're not really burning their energy. just as an aside, people who are hyperthyroid, one of the things that tends to come along with hyperthyroidism is exophthalmosis, kind of where people's eyes get more kind of bug-eyed, which I'm not actually even sure the mechanism behind it, but I do know that people who are hyperthyroid often get kind of these eyes bulging out, which is kind of a classic look for hyperthyroidism. The other thing that the thyroid gland makes is calcitonin. So let me make this clear. So one is this thyroid hormone, which can also be called thyroxine, which is actually a family of things, including this triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine. The other thing that the thyroid gland is making is calcitonin. Calcitonin is if your body like has enough calcium, it kind of keeps the calcium from getting released from your bones and stuff. I think it helps kind of helps store calcium. Calcitonin, I think typically when, as far as I can tell, it's not playing as critical as a role as this other hormone we're about to talk about in a moment when we start talking about regulation of calcium levels in your body. So another hormone or another gland that we need to talk about now is the parathyroid glands. So the parathyroid glands, they are their own separate gland. They get the name para, means next to thyroid. They're actually little pockets of cells actually embedded within the thyroid gland. They're kind of on there's like 4 main little pockets on the back side, on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. Again, I want to kind of make sure it's clear they're their own separate thing. Right? They're not part of the thyroid gland. They just happen to be sitting on top of the thyroid gland. These make this parathyroid hormone. This is released if there's low calcium. So if your body needs more calcium, parathyroid hormone's released. And where are we going to find calcium stored in the body?
Bones.
The bones. So this is going to turn on like the osteoclasts. If you remember from anatomy, we had osteoclasts in your bone, which dissolve the bone matrix, release the calcium into the body. So this kind of releases, calcium from the bones. Normally you are never going to be not have enough calcium because you have kind of an infinite supply of calcium in your bones. What can go wrong is, particularly if somebody, this happens more in women, particularly in kind of small framed women, where this goes on long enough that you extract so much calcium from the bones that the bones start becoming weak and brittle. That's like osteoporosis, in which case the bones now might not even be able to support your own weight. Like kind of the classic thing when like an older person breaks their hip. It wasn't it's like someone fell and broke their hip. That's not what happened. What happened was they took a step and so much calcium had been kind of excavated from their femur that it was no longer sound enough to support their weight. So they took a step and the head of the femur snapped and then they hit the ground. So that's like, osteoporosis is if you take too much calcium out of your bones eventually. The way they originally found out about the parathyroid glands was by doing surgical interventions for hyperthyroidism. Someone was making too much thyroid hormone. They went in and they cut out, the thyroid gland tissue in order to decrease the amount of thyroid hormone, which helped with the hyperthyroidism. But then they got crazy mineral imbalances and they realized, oh crap, we did something we didn't mean to do here. And they realized that there was this other gland that was sitting on top of the thyroid gland there. While we're here, before we leave the thyroid gland, I should also just mention another kind of clinical implication of having the thyroid hormone being made with iodine is the thyroid gland concentrates iodine like a couple of 100 times higher than any other part of the body because it's storing it to make the thyroid hormone. So that means that one of the ways people can go and deal with hyperthyroidism non-surgically is you can actually give somebody radioactive iodine, which has a very short half-life. It only has a half-life of like a couple of weeks or something. So if you give somebody kind of some radioactive iodine, it's pretty low in almost all of their body, but it accumulates and is high enough in the thyroid gland that will actually kill off thyroid tissue. And it's a kind of a non-surgical way to go in and try to take out the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland, and again,
Question about like hyperparathyroidism. Isn't that like when it also releases too much or like more calciums in the body and you can get like tetanus and stuff?
I don't know so much about that.
Okay.
So, yeah, I don't know. It would definitely mess with lots of things because calcium obviously is a major molecule for signaling and setting voltages and doing all sorts of stuff. If you do have hyperthyroidism and they have to take out your thyroid gland, that means you're going to be on kind of exogenous thyroid hormone for the rest of your life. Synthroid is one of the ones they give you. I have a few friends who are just on Synthroid. They have to just they find the right amount and just take their little pills every day because you have to find just the right level to keep your kind of not too fast, not too slow, just right. So it's pretty common. Again, like I said, a lot of people are hypothyroid just from this autoimmune thing, this Hashimoto's, where your immune system attacks your own thyroid gland. So let's see, what time is it? We're still going well. Now we're going to drop down to the adrenal glands. Okay, so we had talked about, the kidneys sitting there in kind of the lumbar region, posterior in your abdominal cavity, and sitting on top of your kidneys. A lot of times the book says, perched atop your kidneys like a perky little cap or something like that, are the adrenal glands. It's important to know that they're not part of your kidneys. Kind of similar to the parathyroid glands are not part of your thyroid. They are just glands that happen to be found sitting on top of your kidneys. They're their own independent little things. And they have two main parts. So so this inner part, this is the adrenal medulla. This is the part we've talked about. This is derived from nervous tissue embryonically. This is basically releasing epinephrine. So this is the part of the adrenal gland that we've already been talking about. It is triggered by the sympathetic nervous system, releases epinephrine into your body for kind of a global sympathetic activation. So we don't got to talk about that anymore. The part that we do need to discuss a little more is this outer part here. This is called the adrenal cortex. This releases steroid hormones. So let's do this now. I'm going to erase this so I have more room. There are three main sections of this. Kind of an outer section, a middle section, and an inner section. So again, this is the adrenal cortex. The outer layer of the adrenal cortex, this zona glomerulosa, it's going to release what we call collectively the mineralocorticoids. So cortical steroids that control mineral balance. You know, even though supposedly there is a family of mineralocorticoids, the only one I really know well and that people usually talk about, at least at this level, is aldosterone. So this is where we have aldosterone released. And aldosterone, you know already. What does aldosterone do?
Keep sodium.
Stimulate sodium absorption.
It tells us the collecting ducts in the kidneys to reclaim sodium, keep sodium in the body. You know, we saw that as a critical part of the renin-angiotensin mechanism. We also saw that when we just talked about general functioning of the kidneys. So aldosterone. So that's this outer layer. Then the middle layer. Again, if you were in anatomy, the zona fascicularis. This makes what we call the glucocorticoids. And again, like similar to the mineralocorticoids, there's one major player people mainly talk about that is released here, and that is cortisol. Cortisol, also called hydrocortisone, is another name for cortisol. And this is your classic, what we call like a stress hormone. This is released in response to stressors and does a bunch of different stuff. You know, it gets the name glucocorticoid because they promote the availability of more sugar and for energy, so you can run different things in your body. It tends to shift things towards dealing with stressors rather than kind of long-term kind of maintenance. it's like one of the in what am I trying to, like, I would say stress hormones are really important for getting your body to have lots of energy and shifting things to deal with stressors. But having chronic high levels of these is kind of unhealthy, because it keeps your body shifted into this state where it's ready for danger and dealing with things, but it's not about taking care of basic maintenance. Like steroid, these glucocorticoids, like, if you're getting prednisone or something like that, or cortisone shots, those, one of the things they do is they suppress your immune response, right? You don't need to worry. In fact, if you're trying to stay alive, you're not worried about, fighting infections, or in fact, major inflammation is probably going to keep you from moving your joints and running away in the moment. So these are often given to suppress inflammation, and they do it awesomely. But you don't want to have that chronically, because it's also going to be suppressing basic, immune functioning, and suppressing maintenance of, your connective tissue is going to start breaking down, because you're not maintaining your connective tissues if you have really high levels of these going on all the time. It's shifting your nervous system into this kind of more like, whoa, ready to go, but at the expense of, kind of running it a little ragged. It's not a good thing to always be having everything ready to deal with, being hyper vigilant and hyper ready to deal with danger. So there's lots of reasons. It's not, having chronic stress is not just kind of uncomfortable and unpleasant. It's also unhealthy. It is lowering, your body's ability to protect itself, to do basic maintenance, increasing the chance of having kind of more long-term damage accumulating because you're not fixing things. So in general, they talk, you want to kind of keep this is a useful thing to have, but, appropriately. There's this guy at Stanford who's written great books and done great talks and stuff. He's a blast to see talk if you ever get a chance. What's his name? Robert Sapolsky. He wrote a book why zebras don't get ulcers, and talks about, a zebra is going to get chased by a lion, and major stressor, really important that his body shifts into high stress mode to deal with it. But then 15 minutes later, either he's dead or he's managed to escape, and then he kind of shakes it off and goes back to eating grass and doing whatever. Whereas humans are just kind of often in this constant state of stress of oh my God, I can't believe that lion, I see its jaws, and can't believe I'm alive. What if I go back? What if he comes back? I don't know, blah, blah. Am I gonna do okay in this class, the finals next week? And then if I get okay, am I going to get into nursing school? And then if I get into nursing school, am I going to get a job? And if I get a job, and then what about my relationship? And it's there's all these things going on that are working to keep these levels high, that you want to you do want to think about moderating it. And again, it's not just physical stressors. It's also, again, emotional stressors. They've shown that, if you take a mouse and you put it in a little cage, in a bigger cage where there's other mice from a different colony that are we don't like you. Why are you in our cage? You don't smell right. This poor little mouse, his cortisol levels go through the roof, even though he's not actually physically attacked. He's just getting the stink eye constantly from all the other mice around him. Other things about cortisol that I think just from studies is worth kind of just mentioning, just as kind of a life kind of information that is useful. They've done experiments where they'll put rats in a cage where the ground or the floor gets electrified every once in a while. Go, ouch! And if you have if they know when it's coming, if it's like it happens, every hour and there's a little sign, it's like, oh, there's the buzzer, it's another hour, ouch, there and again, eventually they don't respond to it. It's like, okay, there's that annoying thing in my life. Whereas if you do the same thing, but it's always random, it's like they get the same number of shocks, but they never know when it's going to happen. It's always just any moment it could happen. They have much higher levels of cortisol. So this idea of trying to, like, you can't avoid stressors in your life, but the more kind of predictive control you have over them, the better, the less overall kind of stress your body ends up. And you can, kind of going back again here, hypothalamus, you can have your brain feeling stress. Brain is then talking to the pituitary gland to release Adrenocorticotropic Hormone, which then is now talking to your, kidneys to release, cortisol, which is now you can have measurable decreased levels of white blood cells in your body fighting infections because your brain is feeling stress. So that's what I'm talking about. There's a lot of interrelationships between all these different, quote unquote systems. So just kind of putting that out there. I think I spend a lot of time here because I do think it's worth realizing that stress is unavoidable, but it's worth like figuring out, integrating things into your life to try to reduce stress, because it's genuinely not healthy when it's prolonged. So you can't get rid of it, but you can try to like kind of work with it. So to finish this off, let's just put in the inner layer. So this is all the middle layer. I'm just going to say inner layer releases sex hormones. The Zona Reticularis. So just like, the main things that we're going to see, particularly post-puberty, that release sex hormones are going to be the gonads. But sex hormones are released in other tissues besides the gonads. They're released here. Pre-puberty, this is going to be a larger contribution to the sex hormones in the body. It can become a major problem if there's some, tumor that's causing hypersecretion. So you can get hypersecretion of sex hormones from a adrenal tumor. So it's worth knowing that the adrenal gland releases sex hormones. But like I mentioned, the primary thing is going to be from the gonads. So I'm looking at the time. I think it makes sense, since all we need to do is to finish up here is the pancreas. So since we already talked about the gonads, let's just do the pancreas and then we'll call it a day. Call the lecture done. So let's do that. So the pancreas, we've already talked about the pancreas sitting right kind of behind the stomach, releasing digestive juices and bicarbonate juice for the digestive processes. So again, the pancreas, is an exocrine. Exocrine meaning uses ducts. right? So the pancreas, in fact, the major part of the pancreas is actually involved with your digestive processes. But then the pancreas also has endocrine function. It's kind of similar to the parathyroid glands. They're little pockets of cells that are making hormones as opposed to making the digestive juices. So, the overall pancreas is kind of like this thing, which is, releasing juices off to the small intestine. But then there are these little pockets, the pancreatic islets of Langerhans. Again, which are their own little endocrine structures. Right, again, this is like a classic physiology question, is like, what gland has, famously both an exocrine gland and an important endocrine gland? It's got both going on, and this we don't have to. Again, we've talked about a lot of this already. It makes insulin. Insulin is basically released when glucose goes up in your bloodstream. And it basically is telling your cells there's a lot of glucose. Take the glucose up out of the bloodstream, tells the liver, take the glucose, store it as glycogen for later on. So insulin, just and again, if insulin is not being released, that's diabetes mellitus. We talked about you can have the type 1, the one that is the juvenile onset. That's basically where your immune system attacks these pancreatic islets so they don't make insulin. You can have type 2 diabetes, which is that adult onset one or acquired one where you end up getting it as an adult, and it's not because you're not making insulin, but because your body tissues are not responding to the insulin that's being produced. The other thing is kind of a sister hormone, which is glucagon. This is going to be released, when glucose is low, your blood sugar is low. So where do you have stored carbohydrate in your body?
Liver and muscles.
Yeah, so in particularly your liver is storing lots of glycogen. So, glucagon is basically going to like turn on enzymes that free up the stored glucose that's attached in your glycogen, your animal starch, and release it to kind of keep your blood sugar up. So insulin and glucagon kind of work together to either take glucose out of the bloodstream if it's too high and store it away or use it up, or kind of release it from storage if your glucose is dropping down. So that's like kind of a first order approximation, a way to think about them. So I think that is going to be it. Are there any questions about these? When we do the reproductive system on Thursday, we'll spend a lot more time looking at the gonads. We'll spend a lot more time looking at gonadotropin releasing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone and all of those. But I think this is where we will leave it for right now.